Liberal Senator Arthur Sinodinos gave his valedictory speech before he moves to Washington to take up the role as Australia's next ambassador to the United States. During the speech, the senator stressed the need to maintain the current global order.
The rise of an assertive and powerful new superpower in China is challenging the liberal order, built up painstakingly over 70 years. Now is not the time to retreat from that order or for nations to practice beggar-thy-neighbour policies. We've all gained immeasurably from the peace and globalisation of trade and investment that's resulted from the international rules-based order. The liberal West must be united in resolute defence of the decent, humane, universal values that underpin that order and to continue to find ways to deepen China's engagement and commitment to that order. The world needs a strong and prosperous China that has a meaningful stake in the existing order.
And Arthur Sinodinos joins me now in the studio for a kind of exit interview-ish. Welcome.
Oh dear, that sounds very daunting.
OK, let's go there. How will you manage a president and a regime that is, by all accounts, chaotic?
I think the first point to make is that I'm there to represent Australia's national interest. The President and the Prime Minister had a very good visit. That set out a bit of an agenda about the sort of issues, apart from the general defence and security and trade interests that we have, around rare earth and critical minerals, around joint ventures in space and how we stimulate the Australian space industry in that context. They've given me quite an agenda, and I was speaking with the Prime Minister just this morning at a small presentation. The Senate gave me a pewter mug to send me on my way.
Wonderful.
And we were talking about it, and we were talking about the fact that there is this agenda to follow up pretty quickly. So there's lots to talk to the President about. But the important thing is, as the President made clear, he and across the administration and across the Congress, there's very strong support for the Australian-US relationship. And one of the things that Joe has done in his time, of course, is to reinforce that by reminding Americans that when it's counted, we've been there in the trenches with them, upholding the sort of values I spoke about in the speech yesterday.
In your speech last night, you said now is not the time to retreat from the global rules-based order. What role should Australia be playing in maintaining that order and in supporting and building global institutions?
Well, the Prime Minister, for example, is off to these various summits in the region later this year, APEC, East Asia Summit and the like. And there are opportunities to talk to our friends in the region and beyond about the rules-based order and what we, particularly countries of our size, and countries in ASEAN and other like-minded countries, the interest and the stake we have in a global rules-based order. And what we're saying is that that's an order that benefits everybody. If we have clear rules that encourage open trade and investment, yes, looking after the people who may be potentially left behind, we all have to do that. And part of course, of what President Trump's doing in the US is he's had to respond to people in the US who feel they've been left behind by the globalisation, particularly of the last 20 or 30 years.
Scott Morrison has talked about not being dictated to by multilateral institutions, essentially. Isn't that contradictory to what you're essentially saying, which is building these institutions, the rules-based order, and yet when it suits Australia, we want to retreat?
No, I don't think we want to retreat.
But we talk up the World Trade Organisation and the other ways of engaging.
For example, we've, not we, but the government has tasked Mitch Fifield with looking at the way we engage with multilateral organisations like the UN. And that's not about us getting out of the UN. It's about how we contribute better and make sure the agendas coming before the UN are agendas which are appropriate for nation states to sign on to. I think part of the issue in the past has been that because of the nature of a big organisation like the UN, where they have to accommodate all these various states which have different systems of government, it's often been the case that, for example, the Human Rights Council will have people on there who may pay lip service to human rights and yet in their own countries are undertaking things which are not appropriate. We've tried to call that out, but what we're trying to say is we don't want then, by majority voting in those organisations, for them to say things about our system of government when we have a system of government which is much more democratic than many around the world.
Sure, but that's the way it works, isn't it? They will say things. Isn't it just about the way you respond rather than retreating? And
the Prime Minister's response was, no, not to retreat, but to say, well, as a nation state, obviously we'll respond in a way that's consistent with our national interest. But what I'm saying is that it's in our national interest to have that participation in organisations like the WTO that you mentioned before, and use that as a basis for having the same rules for everybody, open and transparent, and we all know what we're dealing with.
You also talked in your speech about the proliferation of media which allows people to choose their favourite media, to choose the message they want to agree with. And I think this is hurting democracy substantially. You do too, don't you?
Look, for example, I know of someone in Sydney who said to me the other day that he gets all his news from Russia Today and Al Jazeera. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. He seemed to express scepticism about what you might call mainstream media and whatever. And it's true that today we can choose so many media sources that, in a sense, it's all become a bit customised. And the great danger with that you're alluding to and that I was alluding to in the speech is how do we create a common conversation and be able to agree on common facts and be able to then have a proper dialogue. Does the ABC play that role in your view? Well, I think the ABC's come under a lot of pressure because of the way in which the whole media market has become fragmented and the way that various organisations have sought to carve out their own market niches. So if you're someone who's seen as the broadcaster of record, you're in a situation where if you think you're trying to do your job a certain way, almost inevitably you'll get people saying, well, they've gone too far to the left or too far this or that. And often what an organisation like this will do is they'll react to that and say, well, no, we're just standing up for what we believe to be the facts. But then people are coming back and saying, but we've got our facts. And so all I was saying yesterday is in Parliament, as parliamentarians, part of our job is to stand up for, if you like, a sensible conversation and for the sort of values which have underpinned our democratic institutions and to remind people that a price has been paid for those democratic institutions to exist. Do you think a policy like the GST would get up in the current media environment? I think that's a good question, but the way I would look at it is to get the GST up, it took 4 years. It took a year of intense policy work behind the scenes between August 97, August 98, an election campaign, which we won by the skin of our teeth. We then had to get it legislated, which again took, as you may recall, quite a bit of work in the Senate, and I was very involved in that and saw that firsthand. That was by the way, one of my most satisfying experiences in government, seeing the process of getting that through. But then we had to get it implemented and then win an election to seal the deal. So that, from go to woe, that was about 4 years. And it took constant advocacy. And one of the things that Howard and Costello did in that year, 97 to 98, was work through all the arguments that could potentially be put, and this is the point I'm coming to, put against it. So by the time it was released, they were able to anticipate almost all the attacks. That's what you've got to do. You just got to go out and advocate. And do you think you still can do it in the current media environment? I think you can. And I think what the Prime Minister has demonstrated by his capacity both to define himself in the public mind after he got the job and the way he conducted the campaign is that when he focuses laser-like on a message, he can be a very effective communicator. You said that the government should keep its commitment to delivering a surplus. Yeah. Should more stimulus be considered once that target has been met? My point was that having sweated to get to a surplus and put the budget in the black, we shouldn't just turn around almost before we've actually got one to spend it. In these circumstances, it's always important to be considered and not allow the urgent to crowd out the important. We have to see whether in the last half of the year or so, the stimulus coming through the budget in infrastructure and tax cuts works. The Treasurer's already made it clear he's prepared to consider investment incentives at some stage. There's an agenda that the government is rolling out about ways to improve productivity. So I think it's best in these circumstances to hasten slowly.
OK. What's your biggest regret in politics?
Look, on one level I don't have regrets because I think whenever you make a decision at the time based on the information you had at the time, you can't then look back and say, oh, I wish I'd done X or Y. You did the best you could based on what you knew at the time. One regret I did have, which I alluded to briefly this morning, was I stood down in 2004 when the ICAC inquiry came up. Even though I was a witness, there was a lot of pressure from the opposition. I wanted to fight on, but the advice was it was better to stand down. But I felt in hindsight, given that ultimately there were no findings or adverse commentary, that I should have done more to retain my position, just as Bill Shorten, even though he was a witness at a Royal Commission, stayed in his job. So that's a little maybe personal regret, but I don't have it up as a big regret. At the end of the day, I did what the team wanted. And in this game, when you join up, you're part of a team. And
on science, you had a big message on science in your speech.
Yeah.
Why?
Because I love science. I had being Minister for Science as part of Industry, Innovation and Science was one of, I think, the best jobs I've ever had.
Was it a message to climate denialists?
Well, I said in relation to that we have to work on the basis of the best evidence available. We do that with intelligence. Of course, as elected representatives, we make the final decisions. But the point is, you've got to work on the best advice, and I can't see why that has to apply selectively. And my point on the climate stuff has always been, look, we can do something and maybe ultimately be proven wrong. If so, fine. But if we do nothing and we're proven catastrophically wrong, that's a much more big, irreversible problem.
Is that the most important message you'd like your colleagues to take out from your final speech and your final remarks?
Look, ultimately it's up to people what messages they take out of it. I think that is a message. I think one of the other messages is that ultimately this is a team game, and that you have to accept in politics you can't always do what you want, even as a backbencher. You're part of a team, and government only works if it's a team.
So your message is to your colleagues, zip it?
No, not zip it, but to recognise there's a reciprocal obligation. You get the right to have your say in the party room, but then once we've worked out what we're doing, we go out there and we defend the government's line. But under Scott Morrison, I think people have come together. There's a determination to turn the page, and I encourage my colleagues to act like a first-term government, and I think that will work.
Arthur, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
And good luck.